Integration Station. I'm your host, Michael, a child and adolescent occupational therapist. And with me today is a new co-host, Edith.
Hello.
Also a child and adolescent occupational therapist. Edith, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's very exciting to have Edith on board, one of our clinical leads here at Parkside, and a wealth of knowledge as well.
We would hope so.
Yes. First time speaker, long time listener.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, as per normal, our podcast format is a Q&A, so we'll take some of your questions, throw in some of our own, hopefully find the fun in talking about how we can support the young people in our lives. If you do have any questions you'd like to throw towards us, please put them to the Instagram, which is OTFC Group. Otherwise, podcast at otfcgroup.au is our email address. And we have had some, Edith, we've had some come through over the last few weeks. There are a couple here, sensitivity and sensory seeking for regulation. There's another one on perspective about the TheraPressure brushing, which you are aware of. Yeah. So that one there as well. And I wanted to start maybe with one about personal space, space bubbles. This question is, what can help teach the personal space bubbles, and what other children do and do not like? So this is something that I think comes up a fair bit, personal space. Personally, I do have a 4-year-old who does encroach on people's personal space from time to time. So I'm very familiar with what that looks like and how at times that can potentially be frustrating for a parent or an educator. Mm-hmm. But from your experience, Edith, your own, working with your own clients and others you've had, what do you find works best in terms of personal space or understanding that, and where could we start breaking that down?
It's definitely something that comes up all the time, and you mentioned before that it can impact on parents and educators, but it definitely can impact on siblings and peers as well at school. Often in the space, I would use what I guess I call social communication, social stories to support a young child to understand in the moment maybe what's happening. So a lot of, that was really unexpected for me, or, I didn't know that that was about to happen. Even sometimes in a game, if somebody's coming right up into my space or they're doing something that I don't really like, I might pause and reflect on that. So I'm not telling them, no, that's not right, I don't like that, don't do that, because that can be a little bit confronting and might cause somebody to feel upset. And instead I'm just posing that thought out into the space, and I have seen so much success in doing that. There's also some great online resources which I refer to a lot. There's one called Social Thinking, which is a great tool that you can use, and it has pictures which you can read through and talk through and discuss, which has similar things. So, that person's looking a little bit uncomfortable. What have you seen in that picture that might be making that occur? And you can really unpack it in that way.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
And I think you made a good point. Is what I'm hearing is that there's a combination of the teaching through whether it's social stories or using those online resources. There's one that I think Neil Harris, who wrote a book. It's a sort of a neurodiversity supportive book, neuroaffirming book, I guess, about My Body is a Bubble. And then she's got a series of them. It's like My Brain is a Race Car, and a few other ones that I know that are used by various clinicians and parents alike to help understand the personal bubble and who's allowed in that bubble and what that looks like. So it sounds like what you're saying is, there's some online resources for that, there are some books for that, but modelling it and being able to actually practice doing that as well really helps in a non-judgmental way, because obviously this person is still learning how to interact with others. The other thing I wanted to pose is, from our background as ASI clinicians, we do a lot of assessments around body and spatial awareness. And I guess for something like this, do you see that potentially difficulties in that area from an assessment perspective may also lead to challenges with personal space?
Yeah, absolutely. I speak about this to families all the time. A child might be sitting in the classroom and sitting on the mat and be leaning really up close next to another peer, and they might have no awareness of their body in space. And so that actually is giving them extra information about where they are, because they're getting a little bit of deep pressure by leaning against somebody else. But for that other child, it's way too much. And everybody's personal bubble is going to be different size. Sometimes I suggest children imagine that they have a hula hoop or something around their body, and just trying to remember that, because for one person it might be okay and for another it might not be as wanted. And we can definitely see that within sessions and assessments. If somebody has maybe demonstrated some challenges with their body awareness or understanding where their body is, I would definitely expect them to also have challenges with recognising personal space. And so that's a really good clue of thinking that's something we might work on. Yeah.
I often find, just as a separate thing, is sometimes going almost back to that modelling, is that depending on how you, say in the family unit, how you are with your own child or children, and how into your space you are. And I find that I'm, at home, I'm quite in the space of my son, and we're a very interactive family, and so sometimes he can get a bit excited and get into other people's spaces because he sees that as that's how you interact, right? Yep. And I always talk about consent and going like, is it okay to come in, or would you like a hug, or would you, those sort of things is an important way, I guess, similar to what you're saying with those social stories, about being able to develop that language to be able to understand everybody's personal space is different and their personal bubble looks different. Yeah. So then how do we make it supportive for that person without going, that's wrong, or what you're doing is impacting that other person?
Yeah, and I think we have to remember as well that personal bubble is a different size throughout the day. I'm, reflecting on myself even last night. Got home, warm day, was feeling a bit overwhelmed. My husband came in to give me a hug, and he must have just felt it straight away. And he was like, oh, too much right now. And I was like, yeah, my personal bubble is a lot smaller. And so, a lot larger right now. I don't need as much. Yeah. And so when we think about what's occurring throughout the day, we often hear about being touched out, and that can happen so much, and that is going to impact on what somebody will be able to tolerate. And checking in, I love how you mentioned there, can I touch you? Can I give you a hug? Can I come in and pop your bubble, is something that often some of the younger clients here, we're supporting them to learn to ask. Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. You raised, just want to go back to the point you actually raised before about social stories, and I think I mentioned one by Neil Harris, but did you want to mention more about, for those that might not know, about what social stories are? I know initially devised by a lady called Carol Gray, who worked in the disability sector and specifically wrote social stories of a particular structure, but from your experience having used social stories with other clients, do you want to explain a bit more about them and how they can be useful?
So a social story can be a physical story, and you can have a therapist help you to write one of those, depending on where the child is at with their literacy skills. It might be more or less pictures, more or less word heavy, but it provides an understanding of a concept without, once again, any shame or judgment around it, because it's helping to take away from that particular moment, and is one that maybe you can read each day, discuss through it, unpack what's happening inside it. It might have the particular person involved. So, Michael's first time at the dentist, but equally so sometimes it's really helpful to use a favourite character. So, it might be Thomas the Tank Engine's first time at the dentist, and having something else that's familiar can really open up those conversations. Equally though, while it can be a physical copy, I often will use social stories just in sessions where I'm just discussing what might be in that story as we're interacting.
And that's a good point, because I often find when I don't work with as many younger clients anymore, just do miss that, but having a young person at home, I get enough of that input. But I often, when I am working on those skills or trying to encourage that with parents, is, and I know this happens a lot in play therapists, for example, is actually to work through some of those things in play with toys that you've got to go, oh, look, such and such as personal spaces, do they look comfortable there? And you can get the toys coming along, and I'm using my hands for those that are listening. You won't see that, but it's, two toys playing together. But in that way, some kids really respond so well to that, because what they're seeing is that in real life, And it's not saying you're doing that. It's the toys are still trying to figure that out, and that's normal. That's okay. Like that normalization really does help, and it can take away those feelings. So.
Yeah, I've seen that be incredibly successful in so many different win-lose, personal bubbles, feelings of discomfort around anything. Having something else reenact it is really supportive.
Yeah, so hopefully that provides a few bits of information, some insight into how to work through that. Okay, so that was social stories, personal bubbles. We actually now have a question about highly sensitive children. And that's obviously quite good. There's a sort of groundswell of research and books and other things around highly sensitive people. Yep. I think generally more awareness of that. So the question is, high or more sensitive young kids, can they be sensory seekers for regulation? ? Impulsive ? So I think what the question here is asking is, can a highly sensitive person also be someone that's a sensory seeker? Is that how you would interpret that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think there are two separate things here almost. If I break that down, then there's this whole, I guess, awareness of highly sensitive people. And you were mentioning just off air about more of the I guess, as I said, the groundswell, the information coming through of that. What can you help our listeners through about highly sensitive children or young people?
Yeah, I think that often I'm seeing more and more parents coming in and, there's something that they just can see within their child that is making them feel quite anxious, quite reactive, quite, emotionally labile at times, and they just can't work out what it is. And through the assessment process that we go through, a lot of it has come out that these children are feeling or experiencing certain things throughout their day just a lot more. A lot more, a lot higher. And that's not to say that other people are feeling it less. It's just that, I guess, their body and some of that insight that they have as well is dialed up quite extreme. And a lot of those children may then seek out certain experiences that help them to feel a little bit more regulated. And we know that everyone's central sort of nervous system, I always think about dials on an oven. Some things need to be turned up, some things need to be turned down. And for some of the young people that we see here, or older adolescents as well, what might be turned up for them to help manage those feelings and those sensitivities is movement. And so they may look like they are seeking a lot more or looking like they're more impulsive, because throughout the day, something that might not impact somebody as much is impacting them a lot more.
And I think the other thing is, when people think of highly sensitive, they probably automatically go to, therefore they're going to be more sensitive to noises, they're going to be more sensitive to movement, therefore a reduction in the amount of that. And you're absolutely right. And this is where I think it's really worthwhile to have assessments that explore the sensory system, because from my understanding, for a lot of highly sensitive children, highly sensitive people, it's more of a temperament thing, right? And as opposed to their sensory system. So you have two separate things there. And if you can strip those out, then you can say, yes, you can have a highly sensitive temperament and someone who does experience the world, and it's in a beautiful way. Like, it's just, sometimes I'm like, I just feel like I want to experience some of that excitement or joy, or even, nobody wants to experience fear all the time, but just to be able to experience that is a lot, and it's a lot for these young people. But there's also something amazing about that too. And so what you've got is that one aspect there of sensitivity, but then we also have what's the sensory system actually doing for that person? You talked about that with the oven dial, and in previous episodes we've mentioned about that as modulation. Right? So you've got oven dial, I've got volume dial. You could, I'm sure you could do the side button on your iPhone or something, to the up and down button. Like, exactly that concept is that everybody's systems have different levels of tolerance and different levels of how much they can input. Yeah. And so for a young person who is quite sensitive, for someone to see them seeking things out, they're going, oh, what the, not to throw in a Rove McManus term, but essentially, like, that seems quite strange. They can't be impulsive, can they?
Yeah. Well, when I say oven dials as well, it's because, you might have 4 burners on the stove and they're all going to be turned up at different levels.
Correct.
So you might have somebody really seeking one particular thing, but then needing to avoid something else. So, they might be avoiding sound. That might be too much for them, but they may be needing more movement, because we know that movement can be really regulating for us. And if they're out in the environment and they're really feeling what somebody else is experiencing. I have a lot of parents coming in and saying they're so empathetic.
Yeah.
And their friend is hurt, or even somebody outside of their peer group, and they're really experiencing that. And that can cause increased anxiety, increased need to regulate. And when we aren't as in tune to exactly what's going on for us, sometimes it can appear less appropriate or less socially appropriate.
The more you talk about it, I like the oven dial analogy. In my mind, I'm thinking it's almost like, a producer in a music studio going this level here and that level there to try and get the perfect level. And that's almost what the brain is trying to do that entire time. Again, I'm using my hands, but for those watching, fine. But trying to find the level of that noise, or, in music terms, the level of bass or high or whatever it is. Yeah. But the same with the sensory systems, have to be in for that just right level, have to be managed so carefully. And all it takes is one small thing to switch that out. And for highly sensitive people, that happens a lot faster, a lot more intense. And so they're trying to bring things back to a level. And it might be, as you said, like seeking something out to just keep that equilibrium.
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually a psychologist that I follow. Her handle, for anyone listening, is Dr. Becky at Good Inside. And she does a lot of work and a lot of, parent coaching or carer education coaching around highly sensitive children. And it provides lots of information and, understanding around what's actually happening for those people and how we can support a lot in our language. So a lot of it is around how we're acknowledging how they're feeling and then being able to respond in a way that recognises that's happening for them and also supports some of that regulation.
And I think validation at times can be the best support for a lot of people, particularly when it may be a different personality or temperament to yourself. Easy to jump in and say, well, I can't help you because you're different to how I respond to things, but to be able to validate can really then bring that level playing field.
Yeah, absolutely.
One last question. This is a big one, and there is so much research and so much stuff done on this, and it's about advice on school refusal. Please. And school refusal happens for so many reasons, and I think this is where it can be really hard to provide specific advice as well, but to maybe answer this question with unpacking a little bit more generally on what's happening with school refusal. And there is a lot of research. There's a lot of stuff that's been put out there. There's a lot of work being done. Governments, organisations are working to ensure that school continues to be a safe place for a lot of our young people. And one thing I'd say is, again, it's no one person's fault here, and it's not a blame game. It's more about understanding that the system doesn't work for every single person, and that ultimately the education system needs to be adapted. And if at the end of the day we get to a point where what school looks like is different for each child, that's like gold standard. But at the same time, that's also really, really hard to do. So school refusal as a concept is huge, and in my practice with teenagers and young adults, we see a lot of that. We see a lot of they hit that high school transition and expectations change, and sometimes it's that change that becomes such a big trigger that school becomes just too much. And I'm sure with the clients that you work with, the younger ones, you were seeing it. I feel like it's happening for younger and younger kids more and more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even younger children coming in and then all of a sudden being in this environment that has so many competing demands. And you're right, it's not any one teacher or school or parents or anybody's fault when we have one system that is meant to be working for absolutely every single person, but every single person is so different. It's going to be really hard to manage that. And when any age student goes into an environment where some of those demands are just too overwhelming for them, they may just need to, it's the classic fight or flight. And during this situation, they will just avoid, and they won't be able to go. I've heard lots of terms around, is it school refusal or is it school I cannot, because they actually can't. They can't get there. And it's not because they're trying to be behavioural or, doing the wrong thing. It's just an overwhelming experience for them. And so addressing in any way that we can the underlying things that might help them feel more comfortable to enter that environment in any particular way is probably one of the best ways moving forward. And I do see that when it can be like quite a quick slope down to I can't go at all. So if we can support them at the beginning and support them really proactively, then we might be able to avoid that in its biggest extreme.
And I think there is, and I have to double check, I might come back and re-record or put links in the show notes, but I think it's like I Can't Australia, or there's this school refusal, or I don't think they use those terms, it's more the I Can't website that does have information and links and further, awareness as to why children might find it harder to get to school and why it becomes a genuine, not a capability thing, but a capacity. The capacity to be able to get to school is so limited. And in that, what you're getting is a greater awareness. And I think at times on the surface, what we see is this child is might be perceived this way as making a choice not to come. And sometimes you might speak to a teacher and they say, look, they look fine. They're engaging okay at school, but what we're not seeing is what's happening prior to that. And that, again, that's not the teacher's fault at all. They're seeing what they're seeing in the moment. But I guess the more we know, particularly about our young people, and in particular, neurodivergent young people, is there are some excellent maskers out there, those who do a really good job trying to keep things together just to get to that environment, and they're just holding it all together, and then have to do it all again the other day, and that is just a really, really effortful process.
Yeah, and so then you'll hear, gets to Sunday night, Monday morning, and they've just had this 2-day weekend where they can decompress, where they can be in their safe environment. But we might also hear parents say it gets to the weekend and they just aren't able to do very much at all because they're having to re-regulate before they enter the school environment again. So as you mentioned, what can we do to support that at school? Equally, what can we support from a regulation perspective before they transition into school? But is the focus being in the classroom for a child that is, demonstrating some school I cannot? Is it that they need to be in the classroom the whole day, or can they be in a different environment but still in the school grounds just to start building up that trust again?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess coming back to the question, is it was some advice for school refusal. As I mentioned, there's websites, information, there's content out there to provide some information. But from an OT perspective, I think you really raised a very valid point there about we are guided by our sensory world. So, there's probably a number of factors that make a classroom or a school environment quite tricky. And what we can do to help change how we feel is by using our sensory systems to modulate. If I go back to the analogy of the master at work and the musical box there trying to get the equilibrium right, it's about trying to find, yes, it's safe people at school or things that we can do at school to adjust, but also making sure prior to getting to school, what does our sensory system need, and then can we get that input? And this is where it's better to be more bespoke, to have very specific ways, because each child is going to have it's going to look different for each child. Some children might want to run around a lot. Some children might not want to. They might want some quiet space, some quiet time. And just having those things prior to getting to school can make a big difference. But I think your point around where we can accommodate and adapt, whether it's less time in the classroom, whether it's, lots of schools have learning support and hubs and those sort of things, just to adjust. I mean, the whole concept of things like, flexible learning options and those sort of programs in the high school environment is more and more relevant now, because we understand that not every child is able to engage in the school environment as it is set up. Yeah. So flexibility, I think, is probably the biggest thing.
And then, on top of sensory demands, we have social demands, we have the workload demands. I think about the school and all of a sudden it gets to recess or lunch and it's a really unstructured time, and there's going to be a lot of social and sensory experiences during that time. And so that could actually be a really challenging time for a lot of students. Can we once again be really proactive before and after a break like that, or before and after a transition to a different classroom, so that we aren't at such a high level of anxiety, which is causing, students are pretty switched on. They know what's coming up during that day.
Absolutely.
They'll know that they have a particular lesson or there's a particular lunchtime activity that isn't feeling right for them. And if they can just stay home the whole time, that's going to minimise that.
And kids will be talking about this the night before. So they're
Absolutely.
already going to sleep thinking about that next day is, you think about nights you've gone to bed and you're thinking about the next day or something that's a really big thing happening, and how much that impacts your sleep and how much that impacts how you're feeling. And you wake up the next morning going, I can't do this. And that's a real thing.
Yeah.
That's a real thing. And that's really hard. And as, for a parent, I've only had experiences of sending my son to an early learning centre on certain days when he doesn't feel comfortable going. And that is hard, going like, why do I have to go today? And we'll still go along because there's positive factors there. But even just that, why do I need to go today? Every single parent, guaranteed, wants their child to feel comfortable going to school, because what it means is I know they're okay there. I know they're safe there, because then you don't feel anxious the entire day.
Yep.
Because every parent would be feeling that for a child that's experiencing school refusal.
Yeah.
And that's a really, really hard place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And, sometimes in the morning when that is the battle that the parent is up against, like there's not much that we can we can work with.
That's a tricky one. But again, an important point or a question to raise. So thank you for sending that in. But for some of the other questions, hopefully also some insight there. Edith, I very much appreciate you coming in today. Would you be keen to come back for another one soon?
I would love to come back. Thank you very much for having me.
Great. Looking forward to having Edith back. If you want to send any questions through, again, the OTFC group on Instagram, otherwise podcast at otfcgroup.au. Otherwise, you can send them straight through to Edith.
And send them to me too.
Send them to Edith, and she will be more than happy to take some on. But thank you again for coming in, and we always do a quick shout out to our little man Fletch. So to you, Fletch, shout out from Edith and I, and we'll speak to you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.